Following Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan and began enacting restrictions upon Japanese American citizens directly after. First, the Roosevelt administration forced travel bans and curfews upon the Japanese American population along the Pacific coast of the United States, mainly targeting California. Japanese Americans were seen as a threat to the United States government, despite their uninvolvement with war, race being the only thing confining them to these new laws. Japanese Americans became alienated in many aspects of life, including the workforce, where businesses refused to hire them and racial discriminations against the group surged. Roosevelt eventually created the Exclusion Order directing removal of persons of Japanese ancestry on April 1, 1942, which essentially targeted Japanese Americans and other small communities in order to remove them from their homes and place them in incarceration camps in Hawaii. The depressing reality behind forcing Japanese Americans to move is demonstrated by the extensive packing done by each and every Japanese American family. The instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry was issued by the Western Defense Command and 4th Army Wartime Civil Control Administration in April of 1942. The locations listed here enabled discrimination at the citizen level as people learned to hate their neighbors for their racial origins. Nearly 40 years later, during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, United States representatives hoped to make amends. California's Democratic Congressman Norman Mineta was the reason for the sudden focus on Japanese internment and reparations. Wyoming's Republican Senator Alan K. Simpson also backed the project, having met Mineta, an internee at the time, in a camp. California Senator Pete Wilson also supported the efforts. The governmental movement was supported by Democrats far more than Republicans at the time, which was surprising seeing as both Simpson and Wilson were Republican politicians. Overall, the United States government's apology for Japanese internment did not dismantle the surrounding racism, and instead minimized the impact of the time period, ultimately causing intense debate in communities throughout the West Coast.
President of the United States.
The time it had taken Congress to finally settle on offering reparations shows the hesitant nature of the government to fully apologize, and did not improve diplomatic relations on any scale. The Civil Liberties Act, published on July 26, 1988, and signed by Reagan on August 10, hopes to apologize on behalf of the people of the United States for the evacuation, relocation, and internment of such citizens, and make restitution to those individuals of Japanese ancestry who were interned. The general consensus of the act, as well as the $20,000 in reparation, seemed to be a positive shift after almost a half-century.
Yes, the ideal of liberty and justice for all, that is still the American way.
However, the 40 years that passed between the demolition of the camps and the formal apology speaks louder than ideals or money attached. Mary Murakami, an internment camp survivor, speaks on the time period as well as the redress in an interview with Newsy.
The ones who really needed it were our parents, and they were already dead.
Many of the adults who returned home to find their properties had been demolished would never see apology or reparation efforts. No matter how peace-seeking the Civil Liberties Act portrayed Congress at the time, they were simply too late. Damage had already been done with no hopes of restoring property, friendships, and the working lives of previously interned Japanese internees. Camp survivor Takatora Jim Tanaka reflects on how little $20,000 makes up for lost time, as the significance of the money is widely debated to this day.
I think that 20,000 I don't think it never could replace the freedom we lost, or by losing our constitutional right and all that. Because technically speaking, we let man without a country. That apology, I think just as much about the apology as I do about the $20,000.
After having to build back a life taken away from him, Tanaka is not interested in the government's money. Those who needed the money would have needed it even more years prior to the apology.
Blood that is soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Not in spite of, but because of our polyglot background, we have had all the strength in the world.
Despite the equality promised in Reagan's apology, not all were given the chance to feel the impact of reparations.
I got a letter from Officer Redress saying that I was denied because I wasn't a citizen or a permanent resident at the time of internment. I appealed, and then they came back saying that, I didn't get my permanent residency until 1956. So I was denied again.
Despite the caring and inclusive language within the apology, some Japanese Americans, like Art Shibayama, were never truly awarded any money because of their non-permanent residencies. Reparation efforts to the Aleut people who faced the same destiny as Japanese Americans during the internment period were treated with less significance, proving that the apology did not apply to all impacted by relocation. The House of Representatives' brief mentioning of their group in the Civil Liberties Act barely brushed upon the severity of internment on the Aleut people, and they were only offered $12,000 instead of $20,000. In the article, Why Reparations Are About More Than Money by Carrie Wiggum, she mentions the unimportance of money unless community-wide change is pursued as well. She describes, when reparation measures aren't met with initiatives responding to the structural causes of violence, they can be perceived as blood money, because victims believe accepting the payment means giving up their right to justice. Acknowledgement modernly in government or education is rarely given to the Aleut people. Aleut natives also lost culture because of internment that can never be restored. In an article detailing a native Aleut woman, Harriet Hope, journalist Ryan Schlesser implores, Congress passed the Aleut Restitution Act in 1988, giving a one-time payment to the surviving Onagox evacuees, months after granting Japanese American internment survivors similar compensation. Hope remembered getting her restitution check, reportedly about half the amount to Japanese Americans, and thinking it was a little too late. She said, "This shouldn't ever happen to another group of people again. How they got away with it last time is beyond me." The apology's lack of in-depth analysis of America's deep-rooted racism created a lack of education of the time period, causing modern-day discussion and debate from all sides of the spectrum on internment, and proving that ignorance on the subject still exists. University of Southern California hopes to make amends and reflect on the time period to end debate within the state and country about the moral obligations of modern-day United States and how they should regard the internment camps. Journalist David Williams mentions their plans to award honorary degrees to 121 Japanese American students who were not able to complete their studies in the 1940s after being sent to internment camps during World War II. Sparking from recent conversation regarding the internment, USC President Carol Folt is planning to issue the diplomas 80 years after President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Diplomatic relations between Japan and the United States continue to differ as new political leaders take action with various beliefs. Modern-day figures bring up this prolonged period in alarming ways, forcing Japanese Americans who were interned to speak out in response. Historical writer Livia Gershon, in an article, Lessons from a Japanese Internment Camp, examines Trump ally Carl Higbee recently cited Japanese internment camps during World War II as a precedent for proposed registry of Muslims in the U.S. Gershon explains, as we can see from formerly interned Japanese Americans who are now speaking out against the registration of Muslims, the experience was something they wouldn't easily forget, suggesting that had the apology also included a community-wide education on racial discrimination, perhaps general understanding could have been met about the seriosity of the times. Modern-day opinions continue to arise from political figures with much influence over the country as a whole. The morals of previous United States President Donald Trump are articulated, and the ineffectiveness of the apology is clear in an article by The Digest. The article shares, Donald Trump told Time magazine last year he did not know if he would have supported or opposed Japanese American internment camps had he been a leader during World War II, and reflects that the 2016 presidential campaign has been marked by calls from Republican candidates to create a database of all American Muslims and to have the police patrol Muslim neighborhoods. The lack of responsible education and awareness from the United States government following the apology caused willful ignorance from American citizens with their own opinions of the internment's creation, proving that the conversation behind the relocation centers cannot cease to exist. The time period surrounding Japanese internment should be taught in schools in order to spread greater conversation and education around the subject. The United States apology for Japanese internment did not dismantle any of the surrounding racism, and instead minimize the time period. However, true conversation can arise to ensure nothing similar could happen again, and for the peace of our nation and the welfare of all Americans moving forward.
God bless you all. I think this is a fine day.